I just want to speak with you about a few things related to libertarianism, if that's all right with you.
Sure. Yeah, that's in the list. Libertarianism. Okay, go ahead.
Well, the thing is, I'm not a libertarian myself, but I would like to speak with you on a few things pertaining to it.
Okay.
For example, at least in my youth, I did consider myself a libertarian because I just figured that it was just a very like common sense ideology to have. You know that.
Yeah, myself too. Yeah, I did as well. Sure.
Yeah, that people should have the individual liberty to do what they want, so long as they don't harm anyone. The belief in limited government, the belief in the free market, and all that stuff. But as I grew up and started looking at libertarianism in a more critical lens, I started seeing a lot of cracks in the ideology, and it was mainly in that, like, when you apply libertarianism to a society, let's take the United States, for example. When you apply that kind of ideology with the current culture that the United States essentially represents and encourages, you kind of start seeing where libertarianism just kind of enforces and encourages the same kind of degeneracy and just lack of moral ethics that, for example, that the left and the elites promote.
Yeah, and that's why the Libertarian Party always ends up caving and electing these degenerates to be their representatives.
Yeah, and if we were in a time like back in like the 1950s or 60s, then maybe such an ideology could work, because back then the majority of people were morally ethical, majority Christian, and the kind of ideology could work. But nowadays, I would label myself as more of a populist, because I see it as a more effective way of, for example, reaching to the people, especially to people who not only criticize the current government, but also aren't super obsessed with trying to shrink the government to the point where it's non-existent, but instead utilizing it to ensure that it benefits the people, the majority especially, and not the elites or the left or any other group that is against the interests of the majority of society.
Exactly. I think that, I mean, that you really hit at one of the crucial, essential critiques of libertarianism. I totally agree with all that.
Yeah, but here's my next question, and I would just like to, and this is just my personal question.
Uh-huh.
What is your opinion of Representative Thomas Massie? Because he considers himself a libertarian.
I haven't actually followed him much. I know that he had, didn't he at one time promote Skittle stuff, but now supposedly he's moved away from that. And then, of course,
really?
That's what somebody was saying on a stream. I don't know that that's true, because I don't usually keep up with these people. But I know he's drawn a lot of criticism for his views of AIPAC now. So, if he's moving in a positive direction, that's good. But if he's somebody who is still, wanting to push the sort of Skittle stuff under the banner of being a, quote, conservative, I think somebody had a really good point many years ago. It was a podcast, and I cannot recall the guy's name. I apologize. I'm not trying to be unfair to him. I just don't remember his name. Colin something. But he did a podcast critiquing the way that Buckley co-opted paleoconservatism and kind of destroyed it with bringing in libertarianism. And I thought that was a really good critique of how the actual history of conservatism in America, going from more of a paleocon position to the libertarian position, mainly via CIA operative William F. Buckley. I mean, that tells you right there, that's the whole story right there. And by the way, most of those libertarian people in the 60s, 70s, 80s, as it was sort of gaining popularity, were pretty closely allied with the CIA. In fact, wasn't it, I forget that one guy's name, like the libertarian presidential candidate guy from like 10 years ago was a former CIA operative. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily...
McAfee or McAfee.
No, he's a guy that Alex Jones used to have on all the time, Bob something. But the point is that not even that, I mean, you could conceivably have somebody who worked in intelligence who's a conservative or a good person. But the problem is that there seems to be this continual footprint of people in the libertarian sphere who are almost always subservient to these sort of Rockefeller-style Republican elites. That's why, for example, Rockefeller wrote his dissertation initially under von Hayek. And if you read Road to Serfdom, the appendix of Road to Serfdom is about world government. So libertarianism is another pathway to world government if you look at the funding and the control structure. And I'm not saying that means that every individual libertarian is a bad person or whatever, but this is the problem with libertarianism, is that it doesn't have any fixed principles. Now, if there was intelligence people who had solid values and weren't subservient to, the same oligarchical class, I wouldn't care. But I know the way that they co-opt and subvert these things, and it's always through these sort of, shady operative people who pop up. It's just like that Evan McMullen guy who was like the Mormon CIA guy who was trying to, never Trumper dude. It's the same type of stuff. So it's not accidental that the Libertarian Party just elected some like Skittles, putting things in your butt dude.
Yeah, and I would also like to add, especially when libertarians try and mix like the religious beliefs to sort of like compensate for their lack of being able to give ethical or moral principles for the worldview.
Exactly.
Like Adam Winograd, for example, who is a pretty prominent,
well, I mean, did you hear the debate I did with Yarn Brook?
I heard some of it, but not fully.
And that was the whole debate. So.
By the way, can I point out, it's so silly to talk about free market when that's absolutely impossible given the banking elite. And and the telltale sign too is that, who's funding this, who are the people kind of arguing and Mises Institute and stuff. They're all funded by and connected to these bankers, and there's not going to be any free market within capitalistic banking elitism, World Bank kind of stuff. So it's just absurd. Because they present it, libertarians present it like, well, think about it, we're just on a small scale and we could just have a trade and, you could have your own small business and you wouldn't have to be interfered with. But they never, have you found one libertarian critique of international banking systems?
Ron Paul. I mean, to be fair to some of them.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
That's not, see, usually what we get with the Libertarian Party isn't that. You end up getting these, Austin Peterson type idiots that.
Well, I was even thinking more of Mises and Rothbard and different stuff. Like I could just be ignorant, but I've never seen out of any of them or Hayek critiques of international banking systems.
I mean, that's actually a pretty fundamental. I mean, some of the von Mises people do that. Like Georg Griffin, his whole ethos is that. I mean, he wasn't a candidate. Yeah. So I think you'll get these people who are the thinkers who will write books about that. But then the actual people who step forward to be statesmen, libertarians, they don't really go with that. By the way, the guy I was trying to think of is Bob Barr. He was the 2008 Libertarian presidential nominee. I think he was also a nominee other years other than 2008.
Bob Barker?
No, Barr. B-A-R-R.
One other point I want to make about libertarianism, too. This was important when we were doing in political philosophy. I was teaching it. I wanted the students to be able to see the difference about how the ancients and those in antiquity saw law in the state and how that fundamentally changed after the Enlightenment. So the man of antiquity saw the state is a natural organism and that law was there to promote virtue of the citizen. Then you get to the Enlightenment, people like Hobbes, and the state is conceived as kind of a necessary and artificial. It's a necessary evil, and it's an artificial construction. And then everything gets cashed out, right? Because you have this kind of idea of the state of nature. The man's just absolutely free, and so this becomes like freedom or pure license becomes the absolute. So then law itself has to then be cashed out in terms of negative rights, that it's never talked about and conceived in terms of, no, law should be there to squash vice and promote virtue. You won't find it anywhere in libertarianism, because it's thoroughly an Enlightenment, Hobbesian, Rousseau kind of Lockean amalgamation of nonsense.
Yeah, and you can't really divorce that again from the history of this movement in America, when you had, again, Buckley basically taking over the conservative movement with basically Buckley was constantly promoting Ayn Rand. So you also can't divorce this from Ayn Rand. And the idea was that conservatism needs to move away from the traditional paleo values that it was connected with, and it needs to adopt this more, monetary obsessed framework, getting away from any notions of the collective, which is precisely where we are now, and precisely why these libertarians are always contradicting themselves and can't choose between, somebody who's a conservative or a total degenerate, because it's just a question of who's more or less consistent. Because if there are no collective identities, as Yaron Brooks said in the debate with me, then I guess there's not a collective biological identity either, is there?
Yeah, and Andrew really exposed that when he debated Dave Smith not too long ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good questions there. I appreciate that from a point of view. But, that a lot of the libertarians are better than their system. And I think we can agree to that, And some of them are really good. Von Mises' books are good. The Basics of Economics from a lot of those guys is good. It's just that there's shortcomings, and sort of like it can only go so far, right? Because it doesn't really tell us any of the oughts. It kind of just lays out the sort of general ideas. And I agree with the idea that really, to make the basics of libertarianism work, we kind of need Christian presuppositions and metaphysics. It's really about the only way to do it. And I think you could theoretically have some kind of a freer market system with some kind of a monarchy, maybe. I think that makes more sense. Maybe that's something to shoot for. Because I certainly don't want a collectivist, centralized Soviet model. That doesn't seem to work. So, hammering out the specifics of, how much or how little government, I don't have any answers to that. It's a valid question. There's no easy answers to that either, because we live in a really complex, integrated globalist world. So I don't know how we would even make that work. But I guess those are the basics that we want to shoot for. So we do have overlap with libertarians. We do have a lot of positive assessments of some of their positions. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty, the very problems that the Libertarian Party has, for example, in trying to weed out and suss out these degenerates, they can't do it because the presuppositions of their whole worldview doesn't allow for them to impose the oughts. Who are you as a libertarian to impose an ought? You're infringing upon my liberty. So we either got to go this Crowleyan route, or we got to say, all right, it's time to give up the Enlightenment ideas and ground this in some kind of a Christian metaphysic.
Divinity raises the humanity of Christ through theosis, and that's exactly what we experience.